When someone says that the 2020 election was stolen, that's a good time to introduce them to Occam's razor. I'm Chris. This is Fiercely Independent. And this week's Spot the Spin is brought to you by Whale's Tail Realty. If you're looking to buy a place in Maui, then Sarah with an H at whalestailrealty.com is the person you want to reach out to. Now, Occam's razor, let's move on to that. A lot of people think Occam's razor just means that the simplest answer is the right one. And that's close, but it's not exactly spot on. And I'm going to paraphrase as well. Using Occam's razor is a great tool for spotting spin. So that's what we're going to talk about, is how do you use that tool in a way? And when it comes down to it, it really comes down to when there are multiple explanations for something, an event, something that occurred. The explanation that has the fewest number of unsupported assumptions is the explanation you should probably lean towards. That's probably the one you should accept. Doesn't mean it's absolutely right, though. So we'll get into that a bit more. But here's a good example of that. So you hear hoofbeats, you hear a clippity clop of something trotting down the street. The first assumption or explanation you could have is it's a horse. And the assumption there is, I live in a place where there are horses, so that is your assumption. That's your explanation. There could be another explanation equally right, and you could say it's a zebra. And that assumption, though, to make that explanation true, you introduce other assumptions like, I live in a place where there's zebras out naturally, or I live in a place where there's a zoo and somehow a zebra has escaped and now that escaped zebra has come by my house. But as you can see, there's more assumptions needed to make that explanation sound valid. Now, a third explanation could be, this is King Arthur and his squire has a coconut that has been carried by a swallow, and they're using the coconut to make the clippity-clop sound. As you can see now, that could be true, but needs more assumptions to be like acceptable as valid. So that is the whole point of Occam's razor, is, again, an explanation that has fewer unsupported assumptions is typically the one you should lean toward. Now, let's apply this now to the 2020 election was stolen discussion. And the explanation there would be that the presidential election was stolen due to fraud. So the first assumption you would have to make is that for this fraud to occur, there was an individual or group of individuals who conducted the scheme, the plan for this fraud, because fraud doesn't just happen by accident. It's not serendipitous. It is something that someone would have to actually plan it out, communicate it. They'd have to coordinate it, and they'd have to coordinate it across 5 key states where electoral college votes would make the difference of stealing an election. So Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, you would have to have your fraud occur in all of those states to make it happen. So that's your first assumption. Now, you'd have to have another assumption that individuals within those 5 key states were intimately involved in this fraud, this scheme, that they either perpetrated it and made it happen, they effectuated it, or if they were involved somehow, they turned a blind eye. So county clerks, election officials, election volunteers, registrars of voters, all of these people would have had to play a role in either doing the fraud, making it happen, or again, ignoring it and pretending it wasn't happening. Now you've got to assume that somehow all the audits failed to catch the fraud. So the voter hand counts being recounted, the voting machines being looked at, the audits, the forensics that occurred, all of those also failed to capture this fraud that occurred. So that's another assumption you have to make. Then you got to add another assumption. The courts got it wrong. All these judges that have been appointed both by Democrats and Republicans, these judges, both in state and at federal levels, of the 60 plus lawsuits that were filed, all of those judges were somehow colluding here in, again, 5 different states to say, or to bar evidence. They didn't see evidence, didn't allow evidence, but somehow they all kind of concluded the same thing. All of that would have to be an assumption accepted. And then lastly, and this is the one that I find most interesting, is that for this fraud to have occurred, the perpetrators would have to be so sophisticated, so skillful in that they were able to hide the evidence, hide communications, hide the plans behind this. None of it was leaked, right? So again, there's no identification of who did it because they were so capable of keeping it a secret. And in this day and age, That's an interesting assumption, but you'd have to assume that too to support your argument. So at the end of it, you have a lot of assumptions you have to have happen in order to say that the 2020 election was stolen. The other argument, an explanation of this would be, no, it was a legitimate election, although there were some irregularities. And that would also require some assumptions. The first assumption being, yeah, states did do things differently in 2020 due to COVID. States expanded, mail-in voting. They allowed early voting in some cases, right? But there were some definitely things there that stood out. You'd have to assume that there were irregularities. And you could look at that and say, okay, there may have been some things that looked maybe odd or unusual. There may have been some situations where there was actually voter fraud. Some people did do it. We know that for a fact. And then you'd have to assume all of these things exceeded or were significant enough to change the outcome of the election. You'd have to make that assumption as well. So again, which one has the fewer assumptions that are unsupported by facts? It becomes pretty clear if you're applying Occam's razor to kind of cut through everything, that the one that has the least number of assumptions here, unsupported assumptions, is it was a legitimate election. Now, let's be clear on Occam's razor. It is not a binary right or wrong kind of decision maker tool. It is a framework. So it gets you to look at these assumptions, and there may be situations where there are a fact pattern that has a myriad of assumptions, and that's okay as long as those assumptions are supported by evidence. So Iran-Contra is maybe a good example of that, where it was there were a lot of assumptions, but there was also a lot of evidence that came out to show, indeed, yes. So despite having a lot of assumptions, something could be true, but you need evidence to support it. And that's the beauty of Occam's razor. Again, coming back to, it's not the simplest answer is the right answer. It's the explanation that has the fewest unsupported assumptions is probably the one to lean toward. So I hope that is helpful in having that conversation. I hope it's helpful in spotting the spin. So when you hear your next, conspiracy theory, go through Occam's razors as a framework, and that should get you an answer that is probably more likely to be true than not. With that, hope you have a great day. Stay fierce, stay independent. Talk to you soon.